America's Cold War, Chapter 5, The Nuclear Rubicon, Part 5, Kennedy versus Nixon. The failed Paris summit took place only 8 months before Eisenhower's departure from office. In that period, he would make no further attempt to deal with Khrushchev or to alter American Cold War strategy. More and more as the year progressed, foreign policy moved largely from the realm of Eisenhower's secret maneuverings to the open and messy spectacle of domestic policies. The Democratic candidate for the presidency, John F. Kennedy, had long believed that a sustained attack on Eisenhower's Cold War was the surest route to the White House, particularly given that his opponent in the race was Vice President Richard Nixon. Kennedy's main pollster, Louis Harris, repeatedly stressed this point as the campaign hurtled toward Election Day. The vice president should be put on the defensive in order to force him to admit that the United States was slipping behind in the superpower struggle for mastery. If Nixon refused to concede the point, Harris emphasized, he could then be hit with the charge that he was dangerously naive. If, on the other hand, he accepted the claim that Moscow had surged ahead, he would be acknowledging that the Republicans, including himself as vice president, had failed. It was a foolproof line of attack. Kennedy resorted to it over and over again during the fall of 1960. Scion of a prominent Boston family, graduate of Choate, Choate, and Harvard, the aristocratic Kennedy had been groomed for high office since his youth, if not initially as high as his older brother, Joseph Jr., who was killed in World War II. Following distinguished service in the Pacific in the war, the handsome young man, backed heavily by his wealthy father, Joseph Kennedy, a liquor importer during Prohibition in the 1920s and U.S. ambassador to Britain in the 1930s, won a seat in the House of Representatives and then the U.S. Senate. Now he stood on the cusp of attaining the highest office in the land. Sensing Republican weakness and keen to demonstrate his own toughness, Kennedy attacked on every front. He accused the administration of neglecting relations with third world nations, especially those in the Western Hemisphere. He suggested that Eisenhower was bound by a conservative, lethargic attitude toward the Soviet Union and international communism, ironically echoing many of the charges Eisenhower and Dulles themselves had leveled against Democrats in their 1952 campaign, influenced by the many strategists hoping to attach themselves to his presidency. The senator advocated a more flexible Cold War military policy, enhanced by much higher spending on conventional forces and weapons useful for waging limited nuclear war. Eisenhower's all-or-nothing nuclear policy, Kennedy charged, forced the United States to choose, in the event of crisis, between Holocaust and humiliation. As if that were not enough, the Kennedy campaign also accused the Eisenhower-Nixon team of allowing the Soviet Union to establish a lead in nuclear missile production, creating a missile gap, which, if left unchallenged, could allow the USSR to achieve clear military superiority over the United States in the near future. Not only did JFK not have credible evidence for this charge, he had been given top-secret intelligence demonstrating that the missile gap actually vastly favored the United States. Kennedy chose to disbelieve the intelligence, or disregard it, in order to press home the alarmist message that the United States, under Eisenhower's leadership, was on the verge of falling under Soviet military domination. In other words, Kennedy ran on the claim that the United States was following dangerously behind the Soviet Union in the one category that still truly mattered, nuclear deterrence, even though he possessed a clear evidence that the United States held the lead. Of course, short of traveling to Russia and counting the missiles himself, Kennedy could not know for certain that the missile gap did not exist, but the evidence Eisenhower provided was as definitive as he could obtain. Accepting the president's assurances of American superiority, however, could mean losing a lethal campaign weapon. This the senator could not do, nor would he do it. Though the private Kennedy was not a reflexive Cold Warrior, he was a cautious, quite cynical pragmatist. That the image he now sought to project. That was the image he now saw. That was really awkward, sorry. He and his aides were aware that Nixon had made his name in national policies as a demagogue anti-communist. They knew all too well how effectively Republicans had used the soft on communism charge against Democrats in recent elections. In 1960, the Democrats proved themselves quite willing to take this logic to a new level. And it worked, as the historian Christopher Preble had shown. By stressing that he would redress the supposed missile gap and, in general, beef up the American military after years of neglect, Kennedy gained the support of many voters and donors who might otherwise have supported Nixon. He campaigned heavily in his districts that had lost jobs in defense industries and solicited contributions from aerospace contractors. Voters in industrial regions of the Northeast and Pacific Coast that relied heavily on military spending turned out for him. On Election Day, Kennedy won an extremely close race, defeating Nixon by very narrow margins in several key states. All other things being equal, had he not exaggerated America's military weakness and peddled false charges about a missile gap, he probably would have lost. The missile gap issue, as Preble concludes, worked for Democrats. End of part 5.